When most people think of PTSD, they think of war veterans, of being attacked or injured by an enemy fighter. But with CPTSD, or complex PTSD, the war zone was your home. The people attacking you were your family members. Maybe you were criticized, insulted, beaten, abused, or neglected. Maybe you had to walk on eggshells being constantly vigilant because you never knew what mood your unpredictable parent or sibling would be in. Sometimes they might shower you with love, other times they'd explode, punishing you for speaking up, or for just having an emotion or a need. This is the reality for many people with complex PTSD. CPTSD is what happens when a person grows up in an unsafe emotional environment for so long that their body and mind get stuck in survival mode. So instead of one big traumatic event, it's the result of many wounds over time. And you develop these reflexive responses that you carry into adulthood, and you don't even realize what you're doing. You might self-sabotage or avoid closeness, or you might find yourself getting stuck in people-pleasing, or catch yourself lashing out in anger. People with CPTSD often struggle with self-worth, anxiety, trust, and big emotional reactions that seem to come out of nowhere. But all of it makes sense when you understand it as the after effects of childhood trauma. Pete Walker is a therapist who wrote Complex PTSD: From Surviving to Thriving. He lived through and is in the process of healing from his own childhood trauma. And in his book, Pete explains the emotional and psychological wounds that come from growing up in an abusive or neglectful environment, and even more importantly, how to heal them. And this is a really helpful book, and I recommend it for people who struggle with childhood trauma, as well as therapists and other support people. So let's unpack the book together. We're going to talk about what is complex PTSD and how it shows up in your daily life, the 4F trauma responses, emotional flashbacks, how a critical parent gets turned into your inner critic, toxic shame, grieving your childhood, and reparenting. And of course, we'll look for some really practical options for how to work through these symptoms. So let's jump in. So what is complex PTSD? Unlike traditional PTSD, which usually results from a single traumatic incident like a car crash or an assault, complex PTSD comes from repeated emotional injuries. Now, it's not always in childhood, but it often is. And it usually happens when kids grow up in environments where their emotional needs aren't met, where love was conditional, neglect was normalized, and shame was used as a tool of control. This chronic exposure to abuse, fear, criticism, or abandonment can leave deep scars. Pete writes that CPTSD symptoms can include emotional flashbacks, toxic shame, a harsh inner critic, social anxiety, abandonment depression, people-pleasing, people avoidance, difficulty trusting others, and more. And we are going to go into a lot more detail on many of these symptoms later in the video. But these symptoms are often different than regular PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and because of that, they're often misdiagnosed as depression, anxiety, borderline personality, or even ADHD. But when seen through the lens of trauma, they begin to make sense. All of these behaviors are protective behaviors. They might make perfect sense in an abusive environment, but they just aren't very helpful or adaptive in a healthier environment. So if your parents, for example, if your parents aren't safe for you to open up to, or you and your parents would fight without ever resolving things, then it makes sense as a child to withdraw to your room. But now as an adult, you vacillate between desperately clinging to a partner and then abruptly calling things off. If your parents judged you harshly, it makes sense to expect that friends might judge you harshly as well. So you might take protective measures in social situations, like carefully monitoring everything you say and do. If being super compliant and accommodating kept your parents from hurting you, it makes sense that you develop the habit of being a people pleaser. Okay, so now that we know what complex PTSD looks like, let's talk about how it affects a child's developing brain. Because when the brain is exposed to chronic stress or relational stress or trauma, especially during early development, this can lead to long-term changes in brain structure and function. So key brain regions that get affected involve survival, emotion regulation, and memory. The amygdala, which is the threat detection center, becomes overactive, making the person hypervigilant and prone to emotional flashbacks and anxiety, panic attacks, taking things personally, stuff like that. The prefrontal cortex, this is the part of your brain that does reasoning and regulation, becomes underactive during stress. It reduces your ability to calm yourself or think clearly in triggering situations. The hippocampus, which deals with memory integration, might shrink or it might function poorly, and this will impair your brain's ability to differentiate between the past and the present. And this makes old emotional memories feel like current threats. It also might make it hard to remember things that happened as a child. The nervous system becomes stuck in a persistent fight, flight, freeze, or fawn state. This might make safety and connection feel really unfamiliar or even dangerous. And we'll talk more about that next. So, CPTSD is essentially the brain's adaptation to prolonged emotional danger. These changes to the brain are survival strategies. They're not defects. And with time and with therapy and with practice, the brain can rewire itself towards safety and connection and healing. Brain scans show that when we change how we respond to situations, when we learn and practice new ways to think, or when we face our fears, or we change how we act, our brains physically rewire themselves. Now, I know it can feel like nothing will ever change, like you're stuck in these unhealthy patterns forever, but I have seen it over and over, that when you learn new ways to respond, you can heal these patterns little by little. So back to the nervous system. Pete Walker highlights the 4F responses to trauma: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. In children who are repeatedly traumatized, these responses become survival strategies for coping with overwhelming environments. So over time, the default reaction can become dominant, and then it begins to infiltrate every area of our life. So people who get stuck in fight mode might become angry, defensive, bitter, or controlling. They believe that if they're strong enough or dominant enough, they can protect themselves from being hurt again. They can't show weakness or vulnerability because that just leads to being hurt more, so they keep their walls up. Now again, this is a pretty adaptive response. So for example, if your older brother keeps beating on you, if you can build up your ability to fight him off or defeat him in a fight, then you might keep yourself safe. Or if you can overpower your parents, you can protect yourself from their abuses. If you respond to their put downs with internal anger, then you can protect yourself from their insults. There really are good times to fight. The problem with CPTSD is that people become kind of rigid in how they respond to every upsetting situation. They have this like knee-jerk fight response when the waitress gets their order wrong, or when their boss brings up some feedback, or when their husband makes a request. They get stuck in patterns of believing that everyone's attacking them. Because their nervous system is primed to see people as attacking, they have a triggered response to fight back without thinking it through. When your flight response becomes dominant, you might avoid things that feel scary. You might avoid conflict or constantly worry and plan situations out in order to guarantee that everything's going to work out. Flight types tend to cope by staying busy. They become workaholics, overachievers, or like anxious doers. Their unconscious belief is, if I keep running, nothing will catch me. In relationships, they might be slow to share their feelings and quick to withdraw at the slightest sign of difficulty. This is the kid who was constantly monitoring their parents' mood and left the room at the slightest sign of a bad mood. They might have escaped into books, TV, the woods, or food, friends, or drugs, anything to help them escape the pain and the fear they felt at home. Again, this is pretty functional as a kid, but as an adult, this looks like broken relationships, withdrawal, addiction, and loneliness. The freeze response is about shutting down. These folks might seem dissociated, unmotivated, isolated, or numb. They might withdraw into fantasy or avoid relationships to feel safe. They might feel hopeless or helpless or depressed. This is the kid who wasn't allowed to escape their parents' criticism or beating. They had to just stay there, so they just had to take it. They had to hold still, to go silent. Maybe they fantasized about being somewhere else or having power, or they just tried to make their mind go blank. I bet Roald Dahl experiences this. So, for example, he attended horrible, abusive boarding schools. And as an adult, he wrote novels about kids escaping through magical adventures and defeating evil adults. David Goggins is another good example. As a child, he and his mother were violently abused by his father, and I believe he coped by numbing himself out. He used that skill, and I would probably say overused that skill, to numb physical pain in grueling competitions. So in 2005, he ran a 100-mile ultramarathon on broken feet and pushing into kidney failure. And I find his level of self-discipline kind of inspiring, but I also wonder if he has allowed himself to integrate his trauma and learn to feel safe at rest or connected to his body in any way. Okay, lastly, fawn types survive by pleasing others. They might become codependent, caretaking, or overly accommodating. Their belief is, if I'm good enough, they won't hurt me. These are the kids who deftly managed threatening parents by praising them, taking care of them, sweet talking them, agreeing with them, and complying with them. But these kids also never felt secure. They could never express their own opinions. They lost the ability to speak up for themselves. And as adults, they often fall into and stay in abusive relationships, believing that if they could just be more kind, they could stop the abuser from mistreating them. The whole point of understanding your dominant 4F type is to help you gain insight into the behaviors you're doing without realizing it. When you can see yourself reverting to these behaviors and you understand what these behaviors are rooted in, you can build some compassion for yourself and start to develop more flexible and adaptive ways of responding to situations. So, for example, if you've been stuck in a fight response and you notice that you always get defensive about feedback, you can add on the skill of listening to feedback and pausing without responding. That can give you time to calm down, and then you can think about whether this feedback is helpful for you. If you get stuck in flight and you always withdraw when things feel threatening, you can practice staying and facing those difficult encounters. So for example, the next time there's like a conflict in your marriage, instead of shutting down and walking away, you can practice firmly saying no and expressing your opinion. Even if this feels like conflict, this might be really essential to staying connected. If you get stuck in freeze, you can practice rehearsing action ahead of time. So let's say that you tend to shut down rather than promoting your ideas at work. Instead, you can practice speaking up for your proposal ahead of time. Or if you're a woman who finds that men touch you in unwanted ways, you could take a self-defense class. With freeze, the physical movement is often more helpful than just thinking about or talking about change. And if you get stuck in people pleasing in a fawn response, you could work with a therapist to develop assertive communication and practice speaking up for yourself, expressing your needs, even if it's as simple as asking a waiter to replace your food. When you give yourself new tools to respond to situations, you create a more adaptive and flexible way of being. Just because you may have CPTSD, you don't have to stay stuck in these survival responses. Your brain is wired to change. It just takes some support and practice. Okay, next, let's talk about emotional flashbacks. Okay, so usually when people think of flashbacks, they think of a war veteran seeing, hearing, and smelling a past event. But according to Pete Walker, flashbacks are different with CPTSD. Unlike vivid sensory memories of traumatic events, emotional flashbacks sneak up, often without warning. You might suddenly have this huge feeling that you don't know where it came from. You might feel small, or ashamed, or panicked, or hopeless, even if nothing particularly bad is happening. Walker writes that these flashbacks are the result of present-day situations triggering unresolved childhood trauma. So for instance, a partner's annoyed tone might trigger deep fear of being rejected or punished, even if it's just about your partner having a bad day. Now, I did a whole video about Pete's 13 strategies to heal emotional flashbacks, and I'll link that in the description. But in a nutshell, the key to healing is recognizing these episodes for what they are. They're basically emotional time travel. Your body thinks that you're back in the past. But with awareness, you can learn to name it. You'd say something like, oh, this is an emotional flashback. And then you ground yourself. You feel your feet. You breathe. You come back to the present. And you reassure yourself, I'm safe now. This feeling will pass. You soothe the inner child. You speak gently to the part of you that was once scared and alone. And this practice can help you rewire your nervous system and build newer, safer emotional pathways. One of the most damaging effects of complex trauma is toxic shame and the voice of the inner critic. Walker describes the inner critic as the internalized voice of our abusers, the harsh, judgmental part of us that says things like, you're so stupid, you're such a failure, you'll never be good enough, nobody really likes you. Now, this voice often develops in people who grew up with shame as a means to control children. So, Bobby, why can't you get that right? Turns into the first person. I can never do anything right. And the result is chronic self-blame, perfectionism, and a deep sense of unworthiness. So to heal, Walker teaches how to build an inner defender, a strong, compassionate voice that can protect your wounded inner child. So this looks like challenging the inner critic's lies. So Walker even encourages using anger to defend yourself. So you might say something like, "Don't talk to me that way," or talking to yourself with kindness, like, "I'm a worthwhile human being," or "Everyone makes mistakes," or validating your own feelings, saying, "It's okay to feel sad sometimes," or repeating affirmations like, "I'm not broken, I'm in the process of healing." Now, you'll notice how this becomes something of like an inner dialogue. Your inner critic has become a character in your control room. And the more you practice challenging him, the weaker your inner critic becomes. And you can start to treat yourself with compassion. And that takes us to reparenting. Most people with CTPSD were not emotionally nurtured. Their caregivers didn't model love, safety, or emotional attunement. So healing means learning to give yourself what you never got. This process is called reparenting. It means treating yourself with the care and protection a good parent would provide. And this includes both physical and emotional care. So this might look like eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full, resting when you're tired, speaking to yourself kindly, setting boundaries to feel safe, creating structure and routines. Reparenting means tending to your emotions. So instead of numbing, ignoring, or shaming your feelings, you learn to sit with them and comfort them and validate them. You imagine yourself as the gentle parent that you always yearned for, and then you treat yourself that way. One of the practical ways that Pete teaches how to reparent is journaling to take care of your inner child and to connect with her. You might write something like, "Oh, dear little me, I see how scared and lonely you felt. I'm sorry no one protected you, but I'm here now and I won't abandon you again." And this kind of self-connection, that can be really deeply healing. Okay, let's talk about grief. Many people try to skip the grieving process. It's like they're trying to hold their pain at arm's length, like pushing it away. Maybe you're afraid that it'll overwhelm you if you really accept it. But grief, like this brick, is an important part of healing. And like this brick, it weighs more on us when we're resisting it, when we're pushing it away from ourselves. Ignoring the grief might sound like, "My childhood wasn't that bad," or "Other kids had it worse," or "I should just move on." And we often resist our grief by comparing our experience to others, by normalizing it, by trying to skip to the end where we feel forgiveness. Maybe you try to hold grief off and portray yourself as being okay, all the while carrying this heavy weight around with you. And I can see why you don't want to wallow in grief either. Like, it doesn't help to allow yourself to be consumed by self-pity, but that's not really what we're going for here. It's about kind of honoring the truth of your experience. So Pete Walker describes how healing often requires grieving the loss of a safe childhood or healthy attachment or love or protection. Grief isn't wallowing, it's just facing reality. It's just acknowledging how much your trauma has weighed on you. It's allowing yourself to say, that shouldn't have happened. I deserved better. Or that hurt me. I felt so lonely and sad. And paradoxically, when you allow the grief to move through you, it often frees you to let it go and set it down. Like, there's just something about accepting what you're feeling that helps you move along. You stop carrying it unconsciously in your body, and you make room for peace and joy and connection. Okay, so give grief a place in your healing. It's just part of becoming whole. A huge part of CPTSD recovery is learning to set and maintain boundaries. Many trauma survivors were never taught that they had the right to say no, to express preferences, or protect their time and energy. So as you work to heal from trauma, you're going to find that much of that work happens in relationships. As you start to rebuild a healthier sense of self, you'll probably find yourself needing to limit or end contact with toxic people, stop justifying or over-explaining, say no without guilt, prioritize safety over obligation. And this can be especially hard when it comes to family, but healing means recognizing that biological connection does not equal emotional safety. You do have a right to limit contact with anyone who continues to harm you. At the same time, Pete Walker emphasizes the healing power of safe relationships. CPTSD is relational trauma, and it heals best in relationship with safe, loving people. Now, I'm going to make another video on rebuilding healthy attachments after being wounded in childhood, so make sure to subscribe so that you'll see when that comes out. But Pete recommends starting with a safe person, like a therapist. You know that they can be pretty predictable and empathetic and warm. And then you can add in support groups where you can be coached through healthy vulnerability and interact with other people who are in the healing process. And then eventually you can start building trusted friends that can help you rewire your sense of trust and belonging. Walker doesn't just focus on thoughts and beliefs and relationships. He also acknowledges the role of the nervous system in trauma. When you've lived in survival mode for years, your system can become dysregulated. You might startle easily, have trouble sleeping, feel chronically on edge. You might struggle with digestion or have chronic pain. So healing involves calming the body, not just the mind. And this might look like gentle movement, vagal tone exercises, deep belly breathing, doing a body scan, getting massage or touch therapy, or spending more time in nature. Regulation is a skill that can be rebuilt, and your body can learn that rest is safe. Healing CPTSD isn't about one breakthrough moment, it's about daily practice. Pete Walker outlines several tools that, when used consistently, create real change. So therapy, especially with a trauma-informed, compassionate therapist, journaling, writing to your inner child or processing flashbacks, mindfulness and grounding, which is noticing the present moment, feeling your feet, and breathing deeply, inner child work, which is imagining, talking to, and comforting your younger self, affirmations, replacing the critic with compassion, healthy routines like sleep, nutrition, movement, and play. And each of these practices helps rewire your nervous system. Slowly but surely, your body can begin to believe, I am safe, I am lovable, I belong. And I would just say one of the most hopeful messages in From Surviving to Thriving is this: like, you are not broken. You are injured, and injuries can heal. CPTSD makes you feel like you're defective, like something's wrong with you, but Pete Walker just repeatedly emphasizes you adapted to survive, your symptoms make sense, and you are resilient. Healing takes time. You might fall into old patterns, but each time you catch yourself in a flashback, or you set a boundary, or you soothe your inner child, you're making progress. Like, recovery is not linear. It's a spiral that deepens over time. No matter how wounded you were, you are capable of feeling joy, forming secure relationships, loving yourself, trusting your own intuition, loving yourself, creating a life filled with purpose and peace. Okay, so let's boil it down. CPTSD is a real and painful condition, but it's not a life sentence. Your symptoms are survival responses, not flaws. You can learn to soothe your nervous system, reparent yourself, and quiet your inner critic. And you deserve safety, love, and belonging. Healing from complex trauma is hard, but it's also sacred work. It's the work of reclaiming your story, your voice, and your life. You survived. Now it's time to thrive. Have you read Complex PTSD: From Surviving to Thriving? Comment below or tell me if there's another book you'd like me to summarize. Thank you so much for being here. You are literally breaking the chains of generational trauma. I hope this is helpful, and please take care of yourself. Hi there! If you found anything in this video helpful, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up or share it with someone who could benefit from it today.